This lesson is about how farmers took action to respond to the Great Depression. And it's a really great example of how ordinary Americans have worked together to create change for themselves and for our country. It's one of the themes that we focused on throughout our U.S. history curriculum this year. And so when we look at the farmers and they're taking action to respond to the Great Depression, I also want you to consider the current situation we find ourselves in with coronavirus and the food supply and what's happening to our economy. So keep that in mind as we go through this lesson. So the first thing we look at is farmers that were dumping their milk on the way to market in 1933. And so we're just thinking about why would farmers potentially get rid of some of their product on the way to market instead of taking it to sell? So that is the first question to sort of think about. Interestingly, we had the same thing happening in Pennsylvania just a few weeks ago. So history indeed repeats itself. For the context for this lesson, we're going to look at what was going on for the historical context of the economic impact of the Great Depression. Before we left school, we had been working on some of the causes of the Great Depression, and now we're going to be looking at the impact. So for this first slide on the historical context, we look at how the Great Depression begins in the end of the 1920s. And we remember that a lot of the lead up to the Great Depression was that booming 20s that we studied, where people were going into individual debt. They were spending more money than they had on all of the new products that were available. And also how companies made the mistake of overproduction. And they made too many toasters and too many refrigerators, not thinking that people were only going to buy one for many years. So we start seeing the economic impact of the Great Depression. It was the largest collapse in U.S. history. And some of the impacts of the Great Depression included the rise of homelessness, the bank failures that happened. Remember, we studied about how people had put their money in the bank, and all of a sudden they went to get it out, and it was no longer there. Fortunately, there are now protections. The FDIC was created, so now our money is insured in the bank, but that wasn't the case back then. At the end of this slide, we see that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president, and he starts in a huge economic recovery program. But at the same time, we had an unemployment rate that was at its highest ever at 25%. We'll go on to our next slide. And this is showing us what was going on with farms and banks. So at this point, many farmers didn't own their land. They had mortgages through the banks for their land. And what happened is when the farmers were making their money by growing crops and selling the crops at market, then they could pay for their mortgage. But if farmers weren't making enough money when their crop prices went way down, then the banks could foreclose on their land, which means that they would take the farms away and sell them at auction. And think about what would happen to a farmer if their land is taken away. How would they be able to make money? This next section is showing us some graphs about the Great Depression effect on farmers. And as you can see, we have a significant decline in crop prices. So crop prices went down considerably through this time period. Starting in 1929, the fall starts in the crop prices until they get really low here in the beginning of the 1930s. At the same time as our crop prices are going down, the foreclosures, or when the banks take the farms away, are increasing significantly. We see that the farmers then responded to the Great Depression. This is when ordinary people work together to make change. They did not wait for a national response. They had farm holidays and they had foreclosure protests.